Okay, we have been doing this training on human trafficking for quite a few years, and I would have to say that I saved the very first one that I did in 2013 because the numbers change every year when I do this training. When we first did the training, I looked at it the other day. In 2013, it talked about, oh, wait a minute, here comes Dylan, and I never thought he'd be here on time. Hold on. Now you can hear me saying that I didn't think I was going to be here on time when this goes on to the YouTube channel. So, good morning, Dylan. What I was starting to say is when we first started doing this, we had statistics about how much money was made in human trafficking. And in 2013, the figure was $35 million were generated in human trafficking in 2013. And it changes every year that I do it. It goes up and up and up. And it's now up in the billions. And I've tried to update the statistics. I tried to update them yesterday, and we'll talk about that as you look at the slides. But it is a multi-billion-dollar industry now. And we are always surprised to learn that the United States is the #1 country for human trafficking. It's not Thailand, and it's not the Philippines, and it's not Vietnam, and it's not any of the third world countries that you think it's going to be. It's us. So that's why it's important for all of you in working with kids who have been trafficked to understand a little bit about where they're coming from and what they've experienced and why they may not really want to talk to you. So, so let me share the screen. Okay, and Maritza's new to us, just so that you know the drill here. You're all free to say anything you want to say during these trainings, and I would much prefer you to talk than for me to just sit here and talk for 3 hours. However, leave your audios on mute. If you want to add a comment or ask a question or whatever, just unmute yourself. It's fine. Everybody who comes to these trainings knows that they can do that whenever they need to, and I much prefer it. So the official name for human trafficking is the commercial sexual exploitation of children. So we call it CSEC. And it has changed, and our way of dealing with it has changed a lot in the last 10 years. When we first got into this and began to work with this, for one thing, law enforcement always arrested kids when they were picked up for being with Johns. They arrested them. They arrested them for prostitution. They ended up with juvenile records. And as you'll see, in 2013, the law changed. And after the law changed and these kids were no longer arrested for being forced to do something that they didn't want to do anyway, the whole way of looking at this changed. Law enforcement changed. We began to get in all counties across Florida task force that were composed of law enforcement and GALs and investigators and case managers and people like us to come together to try to work with these kids. So we've come a long way. We have a long way to go, but I'm always happy to provide the training and to have you guys come to it because there is a lot that we need to learn about it. So we're going to talk about the scope of CSEC in America, talk about how easily it is for our kids that we work with to get trafficked and how much easier it has gotten since the pandemic. Because what happened during the pandemic, everybody went into their bedrooms on their computers and had access to any one of a number of ways that traffickers could convince you to get involved with them. We're going to talk about the symptoms and how we treat them. So it is important for us to understand all of this because this is not your average sexual trauma victim. And I know Bonnie's on the sexual trauma team. Carol and I sit on those meetings. And these are not your average sexually traumatized kids. They have a whole different set of symptoms and issues, and we need to be aware of it. So we're going to watch I have a few videos in this. And this one just talks a little bit about the general overview of how kids get involved. Whoops, and we don't want to go that way.
Thank you for joining us. Sex trafficking is an issue we hear about often, but how bad is the problem in our community? It's not something you'll see in the streets in cities like Green Bay or Appleton, but it's definitely lurking online.
The pimps who rope victims into sex trafficking prey on those who are vulnerable, like teenagers having problems with their families. Reporter Alexandra Burley shares what you need to know as a parent to keep your child protected. Alexandra?
The average age of a sex trafficking victim is 12 to 14 years old. Now, the prefrontal cortex in our brains, which helps us out with making judgments and decisions, isn't fully developed until age 25. So it's much harder for a young girl to understand when she is being manipulated. And that's why experts say parents, teachers, and counselors play such a critical role in watching for the signs to protect a child from trafficking.
Matt found me on Facebook. We would chat for hours at night. He was always the perfect gentleman and interested in finding out everything that was going on in my life.
This film, entitled Innocent Sold, was produced in the Fox Cities and shows how easily a child or a teenager can be lured into sex trafficking.
I start chatting with them online, let them know I care.
It can start off with problems at home.
Oh, you're fighting with your parents. Oh, you're not having a good time at home. Well, meet me at the mall, meet me at the movies. I'll buy you, the new pair of Jordans, or I'll buy you a movie and then come back next week and then I'll get your hair done or something.
And just like that, a young girl can be influenced by a pimp and the cycle begins.
Human trafficking is about pimps manipulating young females, typically females, adults and teenagers. They want to gain the trust of that female, whether it be through purchases that they're doing or that their boyfriend, girlfriend, quote unquote, because they want to have something over that young girl's head to then force them to go out and make money for them.
If your child is on social media, pimps will have an easier time trying to manipulate them because of how accessible accounts can be. A local girl says she was a target of sex trafficking.
Honestly, I have been fished for trafficking multiple times. And because my mom is such a strong woman and taught me what to do in instances like this, I made it through.
The Sexual Assault Crisis Center in Appleton works with 15 school districts to teach 7th graders how to look for signs when someone is trying to lure them into danger.
It seems safe because it's just a device, whether it's a tablet or a phone or a laptop of some sort. But that's the number one way that these young children are being recruited.
That's why it's important to have access to your children's phones, and that includes having their passwords to unlock their phones, accounts to social media, and other websites.
Even though the parents paid for the cell phone plan and paid for that cell phone, they cannot give the police consent to go into that phone. The Supreme Court has said that children have an expectation of privacy if the parents don't know the information to get in the phone and regularly search the phone to see what they're doing. So if a parent calls and says, hey, I think my 16-year-old is involved in something, here's her cell phone, I'm going to give you consent to search it. If I say, well, you don't have permission to because you're not constantly searching it or you don't know the passcode, parents freak out about that. But that's just the way the world works nowadays.
While pimps mostly target children online, there are signs parents can look for.
Is the student suddenly missing class? Are they skipping school? Are they going on trips that they had never gone on before, leaving town for days at a time? Also, do they have multiple cell phones?
Matt, we were talking about places to travel.
And parents, take note, if your child is writing about problems at home onto their social media pages, pimps will try to take advantage of their distress.
So there are people out there who are just looking for those vulnerable clues, those vulnerable words. And that's what they're going to glom onto. So again, it comes back to, okay, so if it is open to the public, be careful what you're saying. So again, that's a conversation that parents and teachers and counselors and trusted adults can have with kids. Be careful what you're saying on social media.
If you want your photos to get passed around, you always gotta show a little skin.
The number one way to fight back against a predator is keeping an open line of communication with your child.
Just having those casual conversations when you're in the car and you're driving someplace, or, you know, you're doing something that you do as a family and those conversations come up, just being there and hearing it, listening for those key words.
Sergeant Matt Wilson also told me that the Brown County Sheriff's Office arrested more than 50 buyers of sex, also known as Johns, last year. If you would like to learn more about the resources out there to help victims of sex trafficking, we have those listed in a story on our website at wearegreenbay.com. In the studio, Alexandra Burnley, Local 5 News.
I always get a kick out of this because when this girl talks about the prefrontal cortex and doesn't come online until she's 25, I think maybe she's been to all of our trainings because we talk about that all the time. One of the things that I just want you to pay attention to because you're going to be working with parents, is that whenever Carol and I have been going to these human trafficking conferences now, but they're all online, but for the last several years, and Marina Anderson from DCF is always the one that gets on and talks about all of these sites that kids can easily get to and how easy it is for the traffickers to fish through these sites. And you heard that young girl say that she'd been fished multiple times. And they can find kids talking about they're unhappy at home or whatever. This is a very different thing than when I first started doing this in 2013. It was before the internet had exploded into what it is now. When we took down, or when back, what was it called? Backpage, when that one was taken down, we thought, oh, well, the problem's solved. And now there's like a million other ones that kids can get on. So it's a very different problem than it was when I started studying it. So I always say, is this really a problem in the US? Because I got to tell you that the general public thinks that this goes on in Vietnam. We are the absolute #1 destination around the world for kids who want to have sex with kids. When I say approximately 300,000 kids are currently held as sex slaves, I tried very hard to upgrade that statistic yesterday because this is probably, I think the last time I updated this was maybe 2020. I'm sure this number is vastly different now, but I just could not get a good reading. Every time I tried to query it in Google or whatever, I got numbers that were all over the place. And some of these numbers also include labor trafficking. Some of these numbers don't include the number of boys or trans kids or the LGBT community that are trafficked. Suffice it to say, it's a very big number. And here's the thing, when I say $150 billion industry, I tried to update that number yesterday too. This is the last credible number I got. So we've gone from 35 million in 2013 to $150 billion in 2024. It's probably more than that, but I didn't want to put something up here that I couldn't reference. But it's a lot. And part of the reason is this, that when this first started, this was a very specific type of crime. But once the gangs got involved in it, gang trafficking, gang-related sex trafficking, has changed the whole paradigm of this because they have really gotten into the sex trade business as a way to make money. It fits the gang mentality. If you think about this, if you're selling drugs, if they're selling heroin, heroin can only be sold once. But if you're selling a body, you can sell it multiple times per day. You can sell it multiple times per week. And the gang mentality is to get girls thinking that they are part of gangs. Girls are not part of gangs. They are made to believe that they are a part of a gang. But what is a girl's purpose in a gang? It's really for sex. And that's why they kind of manipulate these girls in to make them think that they're part of this. They're not. And certainly once they're in, they really have a very hard time getting out. The average time once you get it, it's called the life. The average time in the life is 7 years. That's a long time to be involved with something like this.
I'll tell you something. If you pay the price, you can get what you want. I can get it for you. Really? And if you want something really young, that 200, I'll talk to you this couple.
Let me just say, this is a police sting. This is a pimp on the street, and he's talking to an undercover cop. It's just that he talks very fast, so you have to try to, that's why I've got the captions up.
Sure.
How young you talking?
Well, how young do you have?
Well, I don't have nothing younger than 14.
Okay, no, 14 is good.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Well, you're gonna have to add something to that.
Sure.
What you willing to add to that too? Just talk to me.
Well, like I said, this is my first time out.
You know, now you,
So the girls over there cost 2, is that
that's the women.
the women?
Now, if I told you 2, and you know you want something young, and I tell you to add something to it, just tell me, you just pick a figure to that.
Well, I guess, what, 3?
3. If you do 3, you got it.
You definitely just beat us, like, he'll probably stump you out, like when you're on the ground, physically stump you. Yeah, he'll probably hit you with a belt, physically slap you, punch you.
He would beat me with broomsticks, candles. He would burn me with candles. He would take metal hangers and beat me with them and poke me with them, belts, anything that he can get his hands on, he would beat me with. The one time he had beat me so bad that he had ruptured my spleen and it put me in the intensive care unit. So it's like once you knew that he could almost kill you, you'd rather do what he says than to get beat again.
If you come to them, that'll be like 150.
Okay.
If they come to you out call,
Mm-hmm.
that'll be like 200.
Okay,
hour.
and I got a hotel room, so that's an hour call.
Yeah, that's all.
Okay, so 200 each.
Yeah, an hour.
Okay, so I'll give you 4, or do I give him 200 or I give it to you?
Right.
Okay, so I'll give you 400 and then we can tip the girls whatever on top of that.
Okay, that's about it.
Is that all right with you?
How long? I run all this.
Okay.
These are my girls.
Oh, okay.
They don't do them look pretty.
We're all under 18. We're all the same age. There would be a few girls that I knew that were like in their 20s or whatever, but they had been doing it since they were our age anyways. I did wait till 12, and these girls were doing it since they were like 8 or 9, and now they're like 23.
I want to show them and tell them like what it feel like to be that hoe, to be degraded all the time, to be hit on, to be manipulated, to be sold all day, every day. Who was there to stop it? Nobody was there to stop it.
If you go on Shared Hope, Shared Hope is one of the organizations that fights human trafficking. There's a lot of videos on there. The Polaris Project is another one. That's where we get a lot of these videos. What I would say to you is when I try to find videos for our trainings, this is one of the most difficult things to find videos for, because the world of trafficking is so very violent that it's really hard, even when these kids talking about their pimps beating them constantly, and they end up in the ICU or they end up in the emergency room, and they don't often tell the emergency room personnel why they're there. Emergency room and ICUs and hospitals have gotten much better over the years at spotting kids when they come in like this. But these are kids that are brutalized, and that's why they don't get away from their pimp. And after a while, even when law enforcement tries to rescue them in stings, they often don't think that they should go. So these kids can be made to turn over 10 tricks in a day. That's having sex with 10 different people in one day. They make a lot of money for their pimps, and that's why the pimps do it. I also realize that this is not the most uplifting training. I get it. I mean, I look at some of your faces when I show the videos, they're not easy. I had another video that I was going to use, and I just couldn't. It was a dramatization of a young girl who was on her phone talking to some guy that she thought was her boyfriend, and he lured her to come out for ice cream. And she gets in the car and looks at him and says, "You don't look anything like the picture." And the next thing we know, he's dragging her to a hotel room and pushing her in with a guy. And it was a dramatization, but it was so well done. It was so hard to watch that I just said, I can't use this one. So who are most likely to get trafficked? It's our kids. Kids in foster care are the most vulnerable population. And many, probably a lot of our kids in foster care have been molested, have been victims of childhood sexual abuse or incest. And when I have worked at different group homes, the very scary statistic in group homes is that 1 out of 3 kids who run away from a group home or a foster home are going to be lured into the sex trade within 48 hours. And I can tell you that this is true because of time spent in group homes. Once kids are gone, it's hard to get them back. When I was working at Florida United, well, it was a few years ago, it was probably 2015, there were several kids who ran and ran with other kids, and we never recovered them because it's very easy for them to get sucked into this. With 48 hours is not a long time. So if you don't find them right away, it's very unlikely that you will find them. And look at the average age. The average age for girls is 12 to 14. You heard on that video, one of them said that, she waited until she was 12, but that other girls have been doing it from the time they were 8 or 9. Boys are trafficked too, but they're a little bit older. The statistics say they're a little bit older. They're 13 to 15. But the LGBTQ population, that's a very vulnerable population. Not everybody is, especially living in Florida now, not everybody is expansive about your sexual choices. When we talk about the LGBT kids, they're overly represented in the sex trades because if you think about these kids, a lot of them get kicked out of their homes. So if there's family problems and families don't accept them, they're much more likely to be homeless. They're much more likely to be rejected by their families. The confusion or the difficulty with the LGBT kids is that they also don't really understand that they're being exploited. And very often they think that this is their way to get food or shelter or whatever. And they think that they are in charge of their victimization, and they are not. They're also much more likely to get hurt.
I have a quick question.
Go ahead, Christy.
For kids in group homes, what I run into is a lot of times when they're new to group homes, obviously they're unhappy, they don't want to be there. I had one client saying that he wanted to run away from it at one point, and I talked to him about the fact that, where would he go? What about transportation? We kind of went through all of the risks involved, and I also, let him know there's adults out there that are just waiting to prey on children, you know, and this is like an 11-year-old kid. My question is, if they tell us in session that they're planning to run, is that considered harm to self?
Wow, that is such a slippery slope. I'm going to let Carol kind of chime in on this, but here's what I would say about any kid who tells you that he's going to run. You just did what you would do with a suicide assessment. You went through lethality. What's your plan? Are you going to do it? You tried to give him information. I think, and again, I'm going to ask Carol what she thinks as well, but I think sometimes it does depend on situation by situation, because there are some kids that'll tell you in every single session, you know, I'm running away, I'm getting out of here, I hate this place. But there are some kids that are extremely vulnerable and are at risk. And if that's the case, I think I would start with saying, who can I talk to with you about this? And then maybe take it from there. Carol, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that too. And I think they need to have those safe people, you know, that we talk about, you know, who are your safe people. We need to make sure, you know, that you're always safe and you need to reach out to them. And in your situation, Christy, I think with that group home that you're talking about, they seem to be very receptive, the caregivers there at the home. So that may be something where you would encourage him to say, you know, let's talk to them together. You know, let them know that if you're feeling a certain way, that you can maybe have a word, you know, without saying I want to run away, but that you can say to the caregivers, I need to talk to you privately, you know, so that they're not having to say, I need to talk to you privately when all the other boys are listening. You know, kind of having that little safe word to be able to have that private talk, because if they're feeling a certain way, they're very impulsive. So you just don't know what they have packed and ready to go.
I think going through the risk assessment with him scared him enough. He's stable there now, but I was just curious because the way that I look at it is if an 11-year-old or any child goes out into that world with no phone, no money, no adults, that is harming themselves. So I think it's a slippery slope too, but my instinct is that I would want to notify at least a caregiver.
I think you want to err on the side of caution.
Yeah, it's especially an 11-year-old.
Yeah.
An 11-year-old boy running away with no supports, with no phone, with no money, with no nothing, probably wouldn't even last 48 hours. So, and the other thing, because I know Christy's been kind of involved with a group home of late, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but very often pimps target group homes because they know that's their population. These are kids that are there because they've had problems in their families. They're more than likely to have been abused or molested by somebody. If they run, they usually have no good plan in the back of their head about where they're going or what they're going to do. So it's one of those situations where when I was serving as acting VP of Florida United, this is 2015 to 2016, I did a lot of training with the kids. We had them come over into chapel. We had different ages come over. I had a video from Shared Hope that was really rough, but it scared the hell out of them, and that's fine. And it kept a lot of them from running. But the thing that alarmed me is that the kids would come, especially the girls, would come up to me afterwards and say, you know, this van that goes around Lake Monroe every night about 7 o'clock. It's a white van. They described it. They had the license number. We eventually had the police go find the van, and they were definitely cruising looking for these girls to see if they would run, if they could get them to run, and they were going to pick them up. So it's a very vulnerable population. And Christy's, I would just say, Christy, I'll give you kudos because you've handled some really difficult things lately and you've done it very well. So
I was going to say, Barbara, I know in I think it's Pasco County, and I'm sure Hillsborough County has one also. But there's a program called the RAP program, which is basically like for runaway kids when, you know, they're kind of fed up at home or in a residential facility, they can go there. I think it's like a 3-week program where they can go and they receive like intensive counseling, individual group therapy. And actually they make it, I visited one at one time, and they make it really fun for the kids. They have like trips to the movies and, you know, just kind of to reset things before they go back into their environment. So I don't know what's available or where, you know, where Christy is, but I know that they have those out there. So that's an idea also.
Daytona has a program, and they've had it for years, called Beach House. And if you know anything about Daytona, kids would often run to Daytona because it's a beach and you can get lost on the beach. It also became a pimp's cruising ground, where if you saw kind of vulnerable kids wandering around on the beach without a whole lot of means of food or whatever, they would pick them up there. But yeah, that's in Daytona. I'm glad to hear that, because that's really needed. I mean, kids are going to be disenfranchised. They are going to run away. Things are going to happen, and it's very dangerous. And kids don't know that. They don't know how dangerous it is to do it. So scaring your 11-year-old was probably the right path to go. So very good.
I wanted to just talk briefly about the foster care children. One of the clients I had, she had was in a foster home with a young boy, same age as her. When I think she said she was about 8 or 9. And then now when I had her as a client, she's 17. And so she happened to run into him again at 17. It was I don't know, school dance or something that happened. And they started becoming friends again because they remembered each other from when they were younger. As she's telling me the story about how nice he is and all the things that he, you know, well, I can take you to dinner, you know, what all, and talk about things that we've experienced and blah, blah, blah. And she said, but then it was kind of funny because he said I could call him daddy. And I'm like, oh my goodness, now we're in trouble, you know, because this is a young boy who now is pimping out girls that he knows from foster homes. And because they're so vulnerable, you know, he can befriend them. And when I had talked to her and, you know, letting her know about this kind of things that happen, and then the person that was going to adopt her, they would not believe it. There was no way they were going to believe that this young girl was going to get involved in anything like that. She's far too smart. They were just not, and it wasn't but a few months later, she ran away. She went to Ohio. So I don't know. She said she was going to a family member, but I don't know if that's true or not.
Well, in all probability, it wasn't, but that's a very sad story. And that, well, except for Maritza, all of you know that we do a lot of adoption work. And one of the things that you see with adoptive parents is that they're very nice people who haven't been exposed to this stuff. And it's very hard for somebody who's never been in this world that we live in every day to understand that that actually could happen. You saw in the video before when the law enforcement officer was talking about that's standard for a pimp. They'll try to get the girl's trust. They'll try to position themselves as a boyfriend or a father figure. They'll take the potential victim out to eat. They'll buy them clothing. They'll get their hair done. They'll do all kinds of things. But when they turn, the whole MO of a pimp is to say, okay, I have now fed you, I've clothed you, I've done all these things for you. How are you going to pay me back? And the payback is usually, I've got a friend here that you can have sex with. And once that's done, then that worm turns, it flips, and it becomes a very violent world. The young lady who said, who was there to stop it? Nobody was there to stop it, because in that world, there's nobody there to stop it. I can't even remember because it used to come up in the beginning of our trainings. What was the movie that Liam Neeson was in where his daughter was kidnapped and
Take it.
taken? Yes, Taken 1, Taken 2, everything was taken from Liam Neeson, but the world is not like Taken. And Taken must have come out when we were doing our original task force about this, because it was 12 years ago, 12, 13 years ago. And one of the people that was on the committee with me, and we were studying how are we going to set up services for human trafficking, because 12 or 13 years ago, nobody was talking about this and there wasn't any method of treatment. And he kept bringing up this movie. And I kept saying that this is not the way this happened. This was a movie. And of course he gets her back after he kills everybody, but that's not the way this happens. She was a nice young girl on vacation in Europe. She had some money. She went to a party. That happens too. But more than likely, what you're going to see are the kids that we work with that are very vulnerable, that are very apt to believe somebody when they're trying to be nice to them, because it starts out with nice and then it goes to not nice. And since this has become much more of an organized crime activity, it has really switched into a higher level of violence. There are family members that pimp out their kids, no question. I'm sure we've all had them on our caseloads, but this is much more likely in 2024 to be an organized crime activity, which makes it more violent. It makes it more dangerous. It makes it a lot harder for the young people that get into it to get out. So Backpage was the primary way to do this a few years ago. And kind of the typical thing was that if you remember Backpage, it had other things in the front. And then you could go to the back to a certain section and see where the girls, usually girls, but boys, were for sale. And they would have pictures of the young victims in hotel rooms, in various stages of undress. They would make the youth look a lot older than they were, because they almost never mentioned age. But that was the beginning of law enforcement getting involved, monitoring that and trying to shut it down. But it's like the tip of the iceberg. There's so many of these things now. Pimpfeet.com. I have not gone on that website because I don't need the cookies that would probably come along with it. But it used to be the official how-to guide for pimps. And this is a quote from pimpfeet.com. The most important thing is to keep a girl to learn her story, learn what went wrong, and play off it. Convince them to love you, and you won't have to keep them in check. In the beginning of trafficking, it is all manipulation. It is all kindness. It is all, let me take you out. Let me get your hair done. You're the most beautiful thing in the world. And then it changes. And again, you can go on YouTube. You can go on Shared Hope International. You can go on the Polaris Project. You can find all kinds of YouTube videos. They're really hard to watch. Facebook and Instagram are still the primary sources for recruiting. But think about what happened during the pandemic. It really did shift to online recruiting during the pandemic. It was much less personal. It was much less the van going around the cottage at the children's home trying to get the girls to come out of the cottage. It just became a real internet industry. And Mega Personal, Liz Crawler, Skip the Games. There's just some of the ones that Marina Anderson always talks about when she does her training. She's a DCF investigator. And they all look like, when you get on them, that they're selling consensual sex. It looks like these are people that they're prostitutes. They're willing to do this. They're used by traffickers. And there's more of this being developed all the time. It is a very difficult industry to control, as is anything that is ruled by social media. We do our best, as Christy's talking about with her 11-year-old. to try to educate some of these kids who have no idea. And if you think that these kids, even if they are not allowed their cell phones, they can always find a way to do it, and they can always find a way to get on and to get into these things that all look like, you know, these are people that are very willing to get on and help you. So we just have to be aware of that, aware of, oddly enough, it's still Facebook. And Facebook's the easiest thing to get on.
Mhm. One of my teen clients that I had told me about they're like games, and I don't remember what the games were, but when you it's an app, and then when you click on it, it just takes you to a game. But something in there that you left click on it instead, and you can hide photos. And no one would even know that you had photos. And she had photos of herself in lingerie that she was sharing.
Well, and yeah, you know, I know that Dylan is on. Dylan probably knows more about games than the rest of us. But gaming is one of the more difficult things for kids because they do think that they're just gaming. And the next thing we know, they're talking to somebody, they don't know who they're talking to. And it's easy to target them that way too. So if you have kids that are enjoying games or enjoying internet games, I would just keep your ears and your eyes open to what they are doing or what they are experiencing, because these folks are probably smarter than most of us in terms of trying to figure out how to get kids through the internet. I think this is the last video I'm going to show you, but this is on our YouTube channel. We have a human trafficking playlist on the YouTube channel. And I want you to, this is a dramatization, but this girl is allegedly 18 years old and very easily gets sucked in by standard internet recruiting.
Hey, Jessica?
Hey, are you Brian?
Yeah, the studio's just a block away. Do you want to get going?
You don't really look like your profile picture.
Yeah, that picture's a few years old, but anyway, let's go. Come on.
Sure, yeah.
And there's another website for you. This is human trafficking. And that's how easy it is. I mean, if you really looked at that video, because again, it's a dramatization, but the girl is 18 years old. Did she look like a model? She had bad skin, stringy hair. But she was very flattered by somebody that she didn't even know, that she met on the internet, who told her she was beautiful. And he gives her the clothes. He says it's a free shoot. There's no mention of her having to pay for the clothes, pay back the clothes. She gets seduced by all of these supposed people that are telling her that she's beautiful. And the next thing you know, she says, I don't know how to pay this back.
That reminded me of, I don't know if you saw that, I think it was in like the New York Times recently, that whole article about mothers who are using their like young daughters as influencers. So they get all these free like pajamas and bikinis, and they're like 5, 6-year-old girls that they are putting on Instagram. And then they are appalled by all of the men who are commenting on their daughters. And I'm just, I think the question in that article is like, where is the line between like a parent, are you now being part of this trafficking industry with your own child? Maybe like you don't know that you're doing that, but when you're seeing grown men commenting on your daughters inappropriately, and so I feel like this happens, like trafficking is existing even when it's not in that foster care situation either with foster youth. So I don't know, that's what it
I
reminds
did,
me.
I did see that article. I thought it was very interesting because I think the other offshoot of that is that, we all wanted to share our child's baby pictures. And, when you go on Facebook, everybody's got pictures of their kids on there and all this type of thing. I did read that article about the influencing because, again, there's money in that. It's a media industry and there's money in that. And if you have a cute little girl or a cute little boy, and you can get some money out of that, that's probably very tempting. But I think we all have to think about not only what we post about our own kids, but what we allow our kids to post on social media, because that is fertile ground for people that are looking for kids. Um, and it's a different world than when I was raising a child because we didn't have all of this. But if you post a picture, you also can see exactly where that picture was taken and exactly when that picture was taken and exactly where these people are. So um, probably just something you want to be increasingly aware of when you're talking to people. You know that we don't allow kids in the foster care system to have their photos taken. Increasingly, when I see things like people in the entertainment industry that are holding their babies or whatever, increasingly you see that the faces are blurred out. That's wise. Whatever you think about Harry and Meghan politically, they don't post pictures of their children because they are afraid for their security. A lot of people that have a certain amount of money are very careful about not posting pictures of their children's faces. But and Christie's right. That was a very alarming article, I thought, because these were very young children. These weren't even teenagers. These were people who were using their 5 and 6-year-olds to gain some money, but putting a lot of exposure to them. And I think I might have a clip from that in our playlist on the YouTube channel because I did think it was very interesting. So thank you for bringing that up. So CSEC victims, when we say they won't always self-identify, sometimes kids will identify. But the reason that they're often they often end up in something like a group home with the foster care system, and they will not tell you what has happened to them. Because think about the bond, that trauma bond that a lot of them have with their pimps. They think the pimps are boyfriends. And remember, these are often kids in foster care who have had terrible family experiences themselves. So they don't always know what a father should do, what a mother should do, what normal family members do for each other. So it's very easy for a pimp to start out with caring and slide over into abuse without these victims thinking that there's anything untoward about this. But one of the things that we do look for is that they don't have any identification. Most of these kids have no self-identification on them. Most of these kids are not in school because if they were in school, they would be noticed. So most of these kids show up at places like, we're going to talk a little bit about things like NASCAR or Bike Week, or Florida, unfortunately, is a magnet for human trafficking situations. But one of the things about these big things like Super Bowl is that these kids show up with adults who are paying for their rooms, who have nothing to do with what they're doing there. Most of these kids don't even know who they're with. And very often they don't even know what state they're in. Because if you look at the whole trail of human trafficking, it goes through Florida, it goes up into Texas, it goes over into California, and often these kids are moved from venue to venue. They're moved from Bike Week to NASCAR to maybe the Super Bowl, to whatever is happening in other states where there's a lot of people around, and they're just moved from place to place. So they often really don't know where they are. So as we have developed our protocol for working with these kids, so has the Department of Children and Families in terms of the way protective investigators have been taught to interview these kids. And one of the things they are taught is to find out if they even know where they are. They may not know where they are because they've been moved so much. We don't see this as much as we did 10, 12 years ago, mostly because so many people have tattoos. It's a very common thing now for people to have tattoos. But in times past, it was very common for a pimp to have his victims branded. So if you look at this little girl here in the bottom who has a barcode on the back of her neck, looks like she's maybe 10 years old. But very often they might have a barcode, they might have their name branded. I think the branding served two purposes. It identified these victims as belonging to this guy, as being just a part of his stable. It also dehumanized the victims because they were made to be tattooed. And this is a pretty old picture here. It's from MySpace. Remember MySpace? We've all kind of evolved in these things, but this is a little less common. It used to be an absolute giveaway. If you saw a victim that had somebody's name tattooed on the back of their neck, on their chest, on their arm, or whatever, that was one of the easier ways to identify that they were victims. Now, unfortunately, you can't use that anymore because the whole world has tattoos except me. This is just a little bit of the lingo. You need to kind of get to learn the lingo because this does have its own language. I mean, we've been calling buyers Johns for years. That's not a big thing. But it's called the life. And if you have your client talking about being in the life is the life of prostitution. The life is the life of being trafficked. Most kids, if we are able to get them away from the pimps and put them into a safe situation like a group home or a foster home, in the beginning, they will not know that they've been trafficked. So they're not likely to say, oh, I'm so happy to see you. And that's why this is such difficult work. And it's just a little bit more. I won't read it all to you, but I think that, and I'm sure that some of this has probably updated, but I don't really know what website to go on to find updated language for pimps without getting cookies set on my computer. So I think you can really see that there is a whole vocabulary and a mentality that these kids have when they come in. The whole lot lizard thing, if you know anything about the whole trucker mentality, now, if your father or your uncle or your brother is a trucker, I'm not saying that all truckers do this, but Truckers who pull into truck stops and turn their lights on are giving a signal that they're interested. And there are a lot of pimps who will keep their girls in truck stops because it's easy picking. There was a situation a few years ago, it was in the news, where the guy put his lights on and this young girl gets in his truck. And he said to her, "Are you here willingly?" And she said, "No." And he started up his truck and drove out with her and went to the police station. And, that was a rare case of kindness. But as he said, "I'm an uncle, I'm a father." And this kid looked like she was 10 years old. So, but for the most part, you're going to find very easy places for this to happen. And truck stops, unfortunately, are one of them. The way there's one of the videos that I have that shows kind of the intricacies of that is that the truckers can text a number, and the pimp can be in the parking lot with his cell phone. He can get the text. He can say, "Give me your credit card number." They send him the credit card number. He sends off the girl. Easy money for everybody but the girl. So when I say, what do these kids look like? Again, when we started doing this, we did not have law enforcement on our side. Law enforcement really looked at these kids as willing participants in this activity. Now, is that their fault? No, it isn't, because it was the common misconception at the time that these kids were they used to call them child prostitutes, and that they were doing it willingly. And these kids have all of these things. They usually do belong to gangs because they've gotten sucked into gang activity. One of the ways that a pimp can keep his victim under his thumb is to ply that person with drugs. I will give that to Taken. That was one of the scenes in Taken where the girl was given drugs. But it is very common for the pimps to get their victims high and then supply them with drugs, or withdraw the drugs to punish them when they're not doing what they're being asked to do. These kids are really often going to be recruiters. They are going to be kids who have had sex. We had, I think it's gone now, we had a couple of group homes in the Volusia County area. They were very small group homes. They were not professionally run. They were just homes that had 4 or 5 kids in them, and they were run by the local CBC. But at the time, we had a lot of these youth as in our under circle of friends. And one of the kids in the group home shared with her therapist that there was a kid who stood out in the yard and talked on a cell phone to people that the group home people didn't know who she was talking to. She talked on a cell phone, and then she left every weekend. She would run away on Friday and come back on Sunday, which was pretty common. Now, this was probably, I'm guessing, again, this is probably 10, 12 years ago. And I don't think that the people in the group home didn't have any training about this. They didn't know what they were looking at. All they said was, "This kid runs away every Friday and she comes back on Sunday." And the other clients are telling the therapist who is working with them that, as they put it, she comes back smelling like sex. And they were not sucked into the trafficking thing. They were concerned about this girl. But I guess the thing that I'm trying to point out is that at that point, even the group home people weren't aware of what they were looking at. They just thought she was an annoying kid who ran away every weekend. And she would come back with different clothes than she left in. She would come back with nicer clothes. She would come back with her hair done. She would come back with her nails done. She would come back looking different than she did when she left. So here's where I think our thinking began to shift around 2013, that we began to lead, I think, in the therapeutic community, the charge to say these kids are not child prostitutes, and they're not criminals. They're kids that have gotten lured into this, and it's very hard for them to get out. It is very hard. It's sort of, we liken it to like domestic violence. It's really hard for a domestic violence victim to get away from the person that is abusing him or her. And it's the same with human trafficking. It's very hard for these kids to get away. And again, we know a lot more about commercial sexual exploitation of children. We know a lot more than we used to. And because I kind of was there in the beginning of the learning curve, I can say that we weren't in a good place when we first started doing this. We weren't in a good place because law enforcement didn't have the tools that they needed. They've, as I said, certainly have improved a lot. But if anybody knows, in Volusia County, we have a sheriff named Mike Chitwood, who is a very outspoken guy. And he, when I first met him, he was the police chief in Daytona Beach. And he was always saying, we don't have a trafficking problem in Daytona Beach. We do not have a human trafficking problem up there. They got all kinds of stuff going on up there. That was many years ago. He has learned a lot since then, and he's a lot more involved in the fight. But that was just kind of typical of the way law enforcement looked at it then. They didn't think that this stuff was happening. And now we realize that they do. And it happens in all forms. It can happen in just street prostitution. I'm sure that the West Coast has them too. We have, quotes, gentlemen's clubs. We have a gentlemen's club going up towards Daytona Beach. I always think they're such a misnomer, but we've got them. We have a couple of them over in Orlando. And it is very easy for kids to, quotes, get hired when they're underage to be in these gentlemen's clubs. The Super Bowl kind of events, those are big things for trafficking. Train stations, strip clubs, cheesy hotels, like I said, truck stops. But big events are magnets for trafficking. And, you know, we live here, well, I'm in DeBerry. We live close to two huge events every year. Well, NASCAR, really, at this point, NASCAR's got something almost every month. And NASCAR is a big event. Whether it's the Daytona 500 or the Rolex or the Pepsi or whatever, and they attract all kinds of people. Bike Week attracts all kinds of people that have nothing to do with human trafficking, but it also has the capacity for pimps to put kids in these hotels. If any of you go to Daytona Beach, there is a strip going up from regular Daytona to South Daytona. It's called Ridgewood, and it has very old hotels. Other than being in Nevada, I don't ever remember seeing those old hotels that have those neon signs that flash that say AC and HBO. I love those. But they're cheesy, cheap hotels, and it's really easy for pimps to just get girls and station them in those rooms. And it's just a steady stream of traffic during those big events. And I'm thinking the West Coast has got big events too. And you've also got the Hard Rock Cafe. That's another one. Florida's loaded with stuff that are going to attract these kind of events.
So I have a quick question about the new law that DeSantis is putting through about kids' access to social media. Obviously, social media is a recruiting tool for trafficking. And so if this law where children under the age of 14 are not allowed to have social media accounts and have to have parental approval if they're 14 or 15, is that actually going to make it harder to identify these pimps? Because kids will find a way, they always do. And if it is not, you know what I mean? Like, is it going to become more sort of like deep web for the kids and make it harder to expose the actual criminals?
I think Christy's asking me all the tough questions today. I think that anytime you try to put parental controls on something that you can't control, you're going to push it underground. I also know that other states that have tried this, it's been immediately challenged. Because it's sort of like the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. It was one of those things that we tried to do several years ago and you couldn't enforce it. And I don't think we're going to be able to enforce this either. But, you know, Christie's right. Once you take something that you could actually go in and look at as a parent, and then you kind of force it underground, it's always going to get forced underground. It's going to be harder. I would not want to have, I can honestly say my son is in his 40s. I would not want to have the responsibility of raising young children right now, because I think young parents have an almost impossible situation trying to keep their children protected. The young girl who said my mother was a strong woman and she told me what to do. So I didn't get fished. That's your best line of defense as a parent, is to be upfront with your kids, to keep an eye on where they are. When you talk to parents whose kids have gotten quotes taken, they had all kinds of signs that they ignored and or didn't know that they should be watching. But the whole internet thing is probably going to be impossible to control. I mean, it's already being challenged. So, but just as I think Carol was talking about some venue where you could right click or left click and you could put a picture and it could be hidden. There are other ones where you can post something and then it disappears. There's a lot of kind of crazy stuff out there. And again, you also heard that law enforcement officer saying, if you don't put parental controls on what you can, if you don't know the passcodes to your kids, where they're going and what they're doing, if you can't get in and look at what they're doing, if you don't exercise parental controls, you are setting yourself up for real heartache. That's why I think the last time we saw Marina Anderson, and she's the one that really gets into this stuff about which one of these Tinders and all these things are difficult to use. I thought that we recorded it and put it on our YouTube channel under the human trafficking playlist. But now that I say that, I'm going to go in and look, because if it's there, she really is a wealth of information about, and she's up to date on not only what apps you need to be aware of what your kids have, but she's also a real master, because she's in law enforcement, of helping parents figure out how to get into this stuff. So I will check. I'm quite sure that we did put it on. And we've talked about this, Super Bowl, all of these things. They're just a magnet for traffickers. Within the last several years, the task force, I can only speak to the area that I'm in. I don't know about like on the West Coast and what they've done. But the task force, the anti-human trafficking task force in Volusia County, set up a whole training program for all of these little hotels, because that South Ridgewood area is a strip of cheap old hotels. And they've set up a lot of training opportunities for people that work in the hospitality industry to be able to spot girls that or hotel rooms where the door is constantly opening, people are constantly coming in and out all day, girls who are not paying for their own room, or boys that are not paying for their own room, youth that are with people that don't appear to be any kind of a parent. I can tell you that until we moved over here to this place, we were next to a hotel in Deltona. And it was a hotel, I won't name it, but it had changed hands many times in the years that we were there. And each time it changed hands, it got worse. And it got to the point where at one point we were constantly watching ambulances pull in for drug overdoses and stings going on over there. So, but the hospitality industry is key to controlling this, because they've got the rooms, and a lot of this is going on in hotel rooms. Let me see where we are. You guys might like to take a little break if you want to. Okay, why don't we let you guys, it's 10:15. Why don't you guys take 10 minutes and use the bathroom, get coffee, do whatever you want to do, come back at Oh, my clock says, come back at 10:25. Is that okay? Everybody back? Maritza said that she was having trouble because of the storm. And I think we're all having some pretty bad weather, no matter where we are today. So hopefully we will stay on. Every once in a while, we get involved in these things during a thunderstorm and it knocks out the internet. But if you pop out, just pop back in again. Okay, let's talk about who is likely to get trafficked, and it's all of our kids. It's kids from difficult families, kids that, as with Christie's young man, have tried to run away, want to run away. What we have found over time is the most common denominator is childhood sexual abuse. And that's most of our kids, isn't it? I don't know when the statistic was, this slide here. It's been here for a while. Said recruiters and victims, 54% are strangers and 46% are known. That's probably not unusual. Sadly, with some of our families, we have certainly had kids in our foster care system that we're working with whose families have trafficked them. But a lot of it is strangers and people that this is their job. Their job is to find these kids. Their job is to psych them out on the internet. Their job is to figure out what their vulnerabilities are and to play off those. And that's why our kids are so vulnerable. When Christy was talking about the whole social media thing and the whole Florida law not allowing kids to get on social media, if there's one thing that I have learned, that kids can find a way to do anything if they want to. And we had a situation, it was actually at the children's home where a kid had found a phone. She had stolen a phone. They used to steal the phones quite a bit. Stolen the phone out of some teacher's desk or somebody's desk, got on, posted a nude picture of herself to her brother, who then posted a nude picture back to her. It was an incest situation. And I remember thinking, I don't even know how to do some of the stuff that these kids figure out how to do with phones that are not theirs and they don't understand how to get into them and they get past the passwords and everything else. So I think our biggest difficulty in this whole system of trafficking right now is the internet and trying to deal with that. Girls Like Us was written by Rachel Lloyd and it's on Amazon. I looked for it yesterday and I was trying to put a copy of the book jacket on, and for some reason I couldn't. But she wrote a book, I think it was in 2012. She had been in the life, she got out of the life finally, and wrote a book called Girls Like Us, and talked about girls who have experienced incest, sexual abuse, or rape. The boundaries between love, sex, and pain become blurred. Sexual abuse lays the groundwork. The pimp, the trafficker, doesn't need to do much training. It's already been done by her father, her uncle, her mother's boyfriend, or teacher. She's well prepared. If you want some depressing reading, it's $12.99 on Amazon. It's in paperback. And the statistics are pretty consistent. that 70 to 90% of kids who end up in getting trafficked, who end up getting sucked into this situation, are there because they've already been sexually abused. So it's hard for them to figure out, she's talking about the lines being blurred. It's hard for them to figure out that this guy that they don't know, that's asking him or her to call him daddy, he's going to take her out to the mall, he's going to buy her clothes, he's going to get her a manicure, he's going to get her hair done. And then he's going to say, pay me back by having sex with my friend. And once she says no, he's going to beat her and say, now have sex with my friend. And she's going to have sex with his friend. And then once that's done, then he's in charge. But this is the number one thing. And because so many of our kids, it's hard for us to find any kids that we work with that haven't had some form of sexual molestation. They are a very vulnerable population. And that hasn't changed either. The average age of entry is 12 to 14 years. Why 12 to 14 years? They're still at that kind of middle school, not having real good coping skills, not having maybe the coping skills that a 16 or 17-year-old would have, not having had the life experiences, and very often having been removed from their homes and placed in foster care at an age when now they are, without getting into a lot of about child sex, even in incest families, what you often find with incest families is that the incest offender waits for his victim to get a little bit closer to looking like a young lady before they act out on that victim. So you're not as likely to see an incest father trying to have sex with his 4-year-old as you are trying to have sex with his 13 or 14-year-old. And the same probably holds true here, that you have girls that are beginning to look a little prepubertal. They're beginning to look a little bit more like young ladies. They're beginning to look more vulnerable and more susceptible to being sucked into this kind of sex trade. So let's talk about group homes, because we were talking about group homes before. One would not always think that we would have to be worrying about stuff like this, but if you're working with group homes, you really do have to be aware that for many recruiters, they are allowing youth to go into the group homes to recruit. And if I had not witnessed this myself, I would think that this is just overblown, but I did witness it. I did see it happening. I did see staff at the group home being unaware that this was happening. And I can give you some really good examples. There was a young lady, and this went on at Florida United, and it goes on in all group homes. She was brought in, I think it was around Christmas time. She was in the shelter. She had come from another country, I think Haiti, or I'm not sure where she came from, but she wasn't 100% sure how old she was. And she said she was 12. She looked older than 12. But one of the first things I noticed about this young lady is that she was very overtly sexual with the foster father. And these were couples that were running this particular group home. It was a husband and wife. And she was very sexual with him. She was very provocative with him. She was very provocative, actually, with everybody in the group home. And began to go off and have conversations out in the field where there wasn't somebody around listening to her with other kids in the group home. And we began to flag her. We began to watch her because she was promising these kids that they could have beautiful clothes and that there was going to be somebody there to take care of them. The way this particular place is laid out, there is a wide open field to get to the next road off the group home. And that was the path that she would try to take. She knew how to get there. She knew how to get out of the cottage. And at night, where at the time there weren't a lot of lights, she could get over to the field and get over to the road that was there. And there was always somebody waiting for her. She began to try to recruit different kids in the cottage with her, to come with her, with promises, with secret conversations. Eventually, fortunately, I don't even know where she went, but she left the shelter. But what did we learn from that? We learned that we have to be absolutely aware of things that we didn't think we had to be aware of. In the other group home, this was the youth who used to go out in the backyard and talk on a cell phone. I remember saying to the supervisor in the group home, "Where did she get the cell phone?" "Well, I don't know. She came in with it." And again, this was some years ago where we were not aware that we had to be watching this stuff. And she was out talking on the cell phone with an unknown adult. She was the one who disappeared regularly on the weekends. When she came back, the clothing she was wearing was very provocative. But what she was telling the other youth in the group home is, look at this outfit that I have. I didn't have this outfit when I left. My boyfriend bought me this outfit. And if you come with me to meet my boyfriend will buy you some beautiful clothes too. It's very appealing to kids who have nothing, to kids who have lost their families, who have been perhaps molested by a member of their family, who have very little chance of having a happy life in their mind. This looks like freedom. This looks like wealth. This looks like all kinds of wonderful things going to happen to me. Many of the kids that would run through that field were picked up and brought back. There were a couple that were never recovered. And those are the ones that, you kind of lose sleep over, saying, what happened to these kids? Because it seemed to me at the time that we needed to be more vigilant about it. But then we had the opposite thing happening, that we had a van that was driving in on the weekend and trying to get over the gate and trying to get into the cottage to get this particular girl that eventually went someplace else. And the staff, who had been newly educated about how to protect their youth, were practically out there with brickbats and baseball bats. And then I was afraid that they were going to get hurt because they didn't know who was in the van. And we are not talking about some young kid who's just trying to make a buck. We were talking about gang members. So we all have to be aware, if we're working with group homes, of what's happening, about how to keep the kids safe and how to keep the staff safe, because you don't always know who's lurking in those vans. So when I first was doing these trainings, we were talking about 500,000 kids running away from home every year, and a lot of those kids getting picked up very quickly within 48 to 48 hours. Usually it took a couple of days, but many of them would get trafficked very, very quickly. And in the beginning of this work, people like us didn't do anything with this. This was not something that Circle of Friends would have been involved with, or the Children's Home Society, or Devereaux. These were the people who stepped in the very beginning to say, what are we going to do with these kids? Were grassroots organizations. They were faith-based organizations. When I first began to go to workshops on this, maybe 10, 12 years ago, I had never heard of some of these places, because they were little church groups or whatever who said, how are we going to help with this? Well, you got to start somewhere, and they did start somewhere, and they began kind of the charge to take care of these kids. We now do have task force in almost all communities, and it brings together law enforcement, DCF, DJJ, GALs, judges, lawyers, service organizations, and those task force have come a long way in helping these kids. For one thing, the DCF response to a kid who's picked up after having been involved in human trafficking. The DCF investigators have a whole assessment that they never had before, where things that they were supposed to ask these kids to try to determine if they are victims of trafficking and if there's extra help that they can be given. The perception of law enforcement really has helped. It has changed a lot. And I remember when law enforcement really did believe that these kids chose to be prostitutes. And, you know, we've come a long way, and we want to keep going, but we have come a long way, and we do have law enforcement squarely on our side now, but we didn't always. The Safe Harbor Act of 2013 was what changed all of this. The Safe Harbor Act said that no child can consent to prostitution, that no child can consent to being in a life of forced prostitution. Whether or not they say, yes, I want to, this is my daddy, this is my boyfriend, this is whatever, they're in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of the Safe Harbor Act, they cannot make that determination. Because before Safe Harbor, this was the breakdown. 89% of the arrests were the victims, were the kids, were the kids that were picked up in the hotel rooms with the Johns. 9% of them were the Johns. They didn't get arrested much at all, and the pimps hardly ever got arrested. Probably because of where we live in particular. And again, I don't live on the West Coast, so I don't know where your hotspots are, but the Daytona police routinely do stings up in Daytona around things like NASCAR or whatever. And the ones that are getting arrested are the Johns, they are the customers, and no surprise there. It's everybody, it's a very common thing. I mean, there are all kinds of people that you see their pictures, the mugshots of the arrests of these guys, and you think, oh my God, teachers and lawyers and priests and foster parents and people that you don't expect to have ruined their life by doing this, but they do. When we arrested the kids before 2013, they were usually charged with drug possession, because that is another way that pimps keep their kids in line, is that they keep them on drugs. They were arrested for prostitution, and they were picked up as runaways. And they seldom had IDs, which somehow apparently that is a crime, because that was one of the things that they could be arrested for. So now we at least have a law that says that you cannot consent to prostitution if you're under 18, regardless of the circumstances. So what that allowed us to do is that instead of doing a sting, picking up 3 or 4 kids that are 13 or 14, charging them with adult prostitution, sending them to DJJ where no help was going to come to them, these kids now get channeled through DCF for services. So at least they are channeled into an entity that is there to protect them, and that is not there to punish them. And I can't stress enough how much of a change that is, because these kids would get, quotes, arrested. Now they've got an arrest record. It might be a juvenile record, but they're over in DJJ. DJJ is viewing them as child prostitutes. So the Safe Harbor Act really did change everything. It changed our mentality. It changed our way of looking at this. And it changed law enforcement's way of looking at it, DCF's way of looking at it, judges, attorneys, everybody. And when I say this shifted the paradigm, I just can't say that strongly enough, because I remember when it was before, and it was really sad to see these kids being brought in, being hauled into court, ending up in DJJ, and they already felt like they had nothing going on for them. And it was very easy for these kids to believe that they were criminals. And now they're self-identifying as criminals or as prostitutes or whatever. So their mindset was that of being attacked by the establishment. And what does that do to them? Now, the only person that truly loves them and believes them is their pimp. So it made it a lot harder to try to work with them. But DCF did develop a protocol for identifying and treating these youth. And I believe you can find that assessment tool, I think, on the DCF website. Because what happened was that protective investigators were given a tool to work with, to interview the youth when they came in. And if they identified certain things, they then channeled them in to treatment for human trafficking. And it was a way to identify them because they wouldn't tell anybody. And we've already talked about that. We know that incest victims run away more than kids that are not incest victims. And we know that the average lifespan on the street is 8 years. It's a long time to get away. And to me, this is the saddest, that 1 out of every 3 kids who runs away is going to get lured into this within 48 hours. That's not a lot of time. I did have a youth many years ago when I was working at the children's home as a therapist. And this is before the Safe Harbor Act. It was in like probably 2000, 2001. And she was an incest victim. And I wasn't successful with her. I didn't get her on time. She'd already been living this life of being the chosen daughter in a family for many years. And every time she ran away, she ran back to her adoptive father, who was molesting her. And at one point she ran, I still have pictures of this girl. She ran away and got picked up. She hadn't even gotten to the corner, and she flagged down a truck that was going by. The guy stopped, picked her up. She ended up in North Carolina. We never saw her again. So when the child protective investigators pick the kids up and bring them into the child welfare system, this is a whole way of interviewing kids that we didn't have before. Because CPIs are not criminal investigators, and they weren't asking the right questions. So we weren't able to figure out, even if a kid would not self-identify as a human trafficking victim, we couldn't figure out if they were in human trafficking because we were not asking the right questions. So the protocol was very, very specific, that the first thing the CPIs were supposed to ask these kids is, do you need food or water? Because in many cases they had been denied food or water. That was a very common thing for a pimp, just to deny food, to deny any kind of creature comforts, to deny sleep. So the CPIs were instructed to ask, do you need something to drink? Do you need something to eat? Do you need to see a doctor? And why did we ask, when was your last period? Anybody venture a guess as to why we would ask, when is your last period?
For pregnancy,
Say again, Bonnie?
possible pregnancy.
Well, yeah, possible pregnancy, but what happens when you get pregnant? You're out of business for 9 months. So most of these girls were given drugs to stop their periods. Many of these girls were given drugs to stop their periods, and that has its own set of physical problems. So if you have a 15, 16-year-old girl and you say, when was your last period? And they say, oh, I don't know, maybe last year sometime. There's that physical issue that we have to deal with. There's also pregnancy. What happens if you get pregnant as a child trafficked victim? Do you think your pimp is going to let you have that baby? They don't. They're going to beat it out of you. They're going to do something to cause you to miscarry because you are money to them. So if you can't have sex for a period of time, they're losing money on you. And remember, there's absolutely no value for a pimp for these girls. They don't see them as people. They see them as something that they're selling. So if they're harming them, if they're not allowing them to have a period, if they do happen to get pregnant, they're going to get rid of that baby. I can't remember the name of the girl, but it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. There were 3 young girls that were being held in a house by a guy for 10 years. And Carol's shaking her head, so she's probably remembering what I'm talking about. But during the period of time, they had been kidnapped and he had them in his house. During the period of time, one of the girls did actually give birth to a baby. And the other girl talked about him causing her to miscarry 2 or 3 times because she didn't want him to, or he didn't want her to have a baby. And actually that story did have a happy ending, didn't it? They got out. He went out one day and they somehow, one of them got out of the house and ran down the street and alerted law enforcement. And after 10 years of being held in this basement, these 3 girls were freed. But the PIs are instructed to ask girls if they know where they are. Because again, if they're on a trafficking route, if their trafficker is taking them from one venue like Bike Week to NASCAR to Hard Rock to whatever, they're not going to know where they are. They're not going to know what state they're in. They're not going to know what area they're in. They have no way to know. They're just in hotel rooms. Do you have to have sex for money? Seems like kind of a standard question, but a lot of girls don't know that they're being forced to do this for money. They're not seeing the money. Do you have a pimp? And where do you live? Most of these girls cannot tell you where they live. They don't have any identification. Their identification is usually removed from them very, very early in the game. And they might be given another identity. They might be given a different name. But they often just have no idea where they are. And they don't have any way to say, this is who I am. They're also really cut off from their families. Many of them will tell the investigators that they're, number one, most of them have been removed from their families, but many of them are told that if they do try to contact their families, that their families will be killed. And that's fairly common. If you think back to Jessica Smart, who did finally end up with her own happy ending, and she was kept captive for, I forget how long, but a couple of years, I think. But she was told by the people who kidnapped her that her family would be killed. And that was one of the reasons that in times when she could have gotten away from them, she didn't, because she was afraid. Jessica Dugar is the same example, who even when the guy who was kidnapping her was in jail, she still didn't try to leave because she thought that her family would be killed. So these are all the questions that are in the new assessment that CPIs are supposed to ask victims. If they do the assessment and determine that this is a victim of human trafficking, what happens then is that they go into a different kind of treatment modality. And many of them are sent to safe houses. In Florida, there's not a ton of safe houses. But in the safe houses, they run away from the safe houses too. But they are protected as best as we can protect them until they can believe that they need protection themselves. And sometimes that's a period of time.
I had to look that up quick, Barbara, of course.
Say that, Carol?
From Cleveland, Ohio.
Yeah.
And the lady that had the baby, her baby now is 16, the same age that her mom was when she was kidnapped.
Oh my God. Yeah, how long ago was that? That was a while, because when
2002, 2004.
Oh, okay. I knew it was a while ago. And the guy who kidnapped them died in prison. I forget, I don't know if he died or he was killed, but he died in prison. And I think there was, I don't remember, because the girl that didn't have, that had the babies that he caused her to miscarry, has done a lot of lecturing. I mean, it's an amazing case of resiliency for those kids, because that was 10 years that they were in that situation together.
It said the kidnapper, his last name is Castro, 52, he hung himself in the.
Okay, yeah, I didn't think it was something good, but he did hang himself, and there was some discussion about studying his brain during the autopsy to figure out if there was anything in his brain that caused him to do that. And I don't know what the end of that was, but it was a particularly gory story. And it did have a good end for the two women. And I do remember that the girl who he had caused to have the miscarriages gave a victim impact statement and basically said, I am not going to allow you to control me by what you did to me. And I thought she was just amazingly strong. So it's good to know that some people do get out of that and get past that. But most of your kids, if you begin to do any kind of work with CSEC victims, they are probably going to deny being victimized because they only really trust their pimp. And that's the trauma bond. They're afraid to do anything else. They've been told not to do anything else. They've been told that nobody wanted them, that their family doesn't want them, that the law doesn't want them, that foster care doesn't want them. And they often run away. And they often run away several times before they finally say, okay, maybe you are there to help me. And that's kind of frustrating for our therapists because you're all trained to help people and you're all trained to be there. And these kids often just don't want your help right away.
I had a client who once I approached the situation from like that Stockholm syndrome trauma bonding perspective, I feel like it really helped her to understand that she was a victim because we kind of went through this whole like, what was she getting out of the relationship and what was he getting out of it? And I think once she saw that like it was reciprocal, I mean, in a sort of, but in that trauma bonding way, she was able to realize like, okay, like I am a victim. So I feel like there's a lot of new research on the whole Stockholm syndrome related to human trafficking now, right?
Right.
Like that's newer. But yeah, because it took a while for her to realize, like she was so in denial about the fact that she was a victim. But then when we sort of explored that relationship, I think that it helped her identify that she was.
Yeah, and that's excellent. That really is. And yeah, it's getting through that whole Stockholm syndrome mentality is kind of where you have to start. There's not a lot of safe houses. I know this one in Sarasota, Carol, because they were set up next to us at the SCC a couple years ago. Sora's, or I forget what it's called.
Selah.
Yes, that's Selah. And I don't know much about them other than I know they're there. And there's one in Miami that Citrus runs, and they have run it in connection with data processing from USF about their program. So that's been almost like a study in how to work with human trafficking victims. And again, I don't know what the Salem model is, but I know the one in Miami, they started out having the kids in group homes, ended up recruiting foster parents and having them in single homes, just one kid in a home, and found that that was a little more successful because they had specially trained foster parents who were just there to kind of do every day what Christy just said she did. You know, that you are worth it. You were victimized. You didn't deserve what happened to you. And what they found once they went to the single home model is that the kids ran away less frequently. That they were more apt to be amenable to treatment because they came to that realization a little more quickly that they didn't deserve to have this happen to them. But when you've been involved in that kind of mind control, it's difficult. It really is. How long ago was that, Christy?
That was September through December. I think. Yeah, so very recent. And I just remember when we kind of went through it, it was sort of an exercise of giving her power back.
Mhm. Yeah, that's good.
Because she was able to kind of, it's hard to explain, but anyway, I think that research behind Stockholm Syndrome and human trafficking seems to be really important.
Mhm.
And yeah, so I was glad to see that on the slide.
Good. Yeah, it is classic. And again, if you are the pimp and you've cut this girl or boy off from everything around them, then you are everything to that victim. They have nothing else. So they're controlling your thoughts, they're controlling what you think, they're controlling what you eat, what you drink, what your body does. And these girls are 100% dependent on these guys. So and I say guys because it's mostly guys, but we've certainly had enough women who have done this too. But the model is always the same. It's just total control. And I'm the only one. I'm the only one that can give you food or water or medical treatment or anything. So, and I'm the only one that can beat you until you're bloody if you don't do what I say. So it's a very complex situation that we're trying to deal with when we're trying to help people understand that they didn't deserve this and that there are other people out there that will help them. And these are the statistics about how this happens to begin with, that 43% of victims reported physical force or rape as the way they got into this. 47% reported fraud, but 70% reported coercion. And that was their initial exposure. And what do we mean by coercion? It's like that video with that girl. She's done a little modeling. She's gotten duped into that. And now the guy says, "Well, you owe me back for that money." And she has no idea. And she says, "What do you mean I owe you back for the clothes?" And he says, "I got something you can do." And if you think about that kind of a circumstance for a young girl or a young man, once you have been forced into having sex with somebody, you lose a little bit of who you are. And then every day, you lose more of who you are. You are not worth anything in your own mind. You're not worth anything to anybody except this guy. So it's a real mind game. Oops. When we say kids can never consent to prostitution, I don't care what they are telling you as a therapist. I don't care if they say, "I love this guy, he's my boyfriend. I want to be with him. I want to have sex to make him happy." It doesn't matter. In the eyes of the law, you as a child cannot consent. You can emotionally think that you're consenting, but in the eyes of the law, you cannot consent. And the fact that you can't consent is what has helped us to move this whole path of treatment forward a little bit. That what we found when we were doing this research is that there's just no single best practice here. That there's no single one thing that you can do that will move this victim forward. And when I say we have to start somewhere, those of us who have gone through the CCTP training, the Eric Gentry training, we know that he always says that it doesn't matter what you use. It doesn't matter if you're using CPT or DBT or blah, 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 motivational interviewing. What matters the most in a relationship? What is it that Gentry always tells us? What matters the most in any kind of treatment? I probably sat through this Gentry training a lot more than the rest of you. But what he always says is that it does not matter what you use. What matters is that your client thinks that you care about him or her, that your client believes that you want to help him or her. So when I say there's no single best practice, we did not find one when we were doing the research. I haven't found one yet, but I think we do know that if you go in, kind of like Christy did, and say, you know, I'm here, I care about you, I'm not judging you, I'm trying to help you to understand what I think is happening for you. And if you do it with compassion, and if you do it and they do believe that you are wanting to help them, that's 90% of the game. You know, we can all learn how to do CPT. We can all learn how to do motivational interviewing, but we can't learn how to care. And you're all therapists, so you've already got it in your DNA to begin with. So, but that is the best, that is the best model that you can have.
Well, and I think when you're using a type of therapy that you really feel connected with can help to show, you know, your caring nature.
Yeah.
Because you're feeling confident about what you're telling them or
Right.
teaching.
Yeah, and that isn't even the purpose of this training, but I will say that we do very much believe that I don't care what any of you use. I mean, what do we do training? We do training in art therapy and bibliotherapy and CPT and expressive therapies and this and that and the other thing. It doesn't matter what you use. If you are using a method that you're comfortable and grounded with, and it allows your caring to come through, you're 90% ahead of the game at this point. And for these kids, this isn't, when I say this isn't work for the beginning therapist, frankly, none of our clients are work for a beginning therapist. They're hard. But we have to make sure that whatever we're doing is strength-based, that we understand that something awful has happened to these kids. But the third thing I added a few years ago, that you have to understand gang dynamics. Because when I say gang dynamics or gang culture, in gang culture, if you look at boys, for example, how do boys get sucked into gangs? What is it that makes a young boy think that the Crips or the Bloods or whoever is going to be good for them? What's the common denominator for kids that are easily sucked into drugs or into gangs?
They feel like they're part of a family.
Absolutely. Yes. That family thing, that's like, what's his name? And Fast and Furious, Vin Diesel. He uses, we're family, 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 family. He's a thug, but never mind. They feel like they're part of a family. And I mean, what do we know about gangs? We know that the family mentality, how do you get into a gang? You can get beaten in, you can get sexed in. Does that sound like a family? But that's the family. And girls think that they are a part of the gang. Girls are not a part of a gang. Gangs are very, what's the word I want? They're very male driven. But the girls are necessary. So they're necessary because they need their bodies. But for a girl, if you have a girl and she says, well, I'm a member of the whatever, the Bloods, the Crips, whatever it is, I am a member of this. They're not. They're not a member of this. The thing up here in this Grand Theft Auto, if you remember a couple of years ago, maybe you don't, that two kids, they were 12 and 14, ran away from the children's home, and ran down the road and broke into a house. And there was nobody in the house. But there were guns in the house. So now we have a 12 and a 14-year-old with the guns. And the 14-year-old said to the 12-year-old, we're going to roll it like GTA. And she got completely involved in this fantasy of being in Grand Theft Auto. Now the police are there. The police have come. The police are trying to get them out, and they're shooting at the police because in their minds they were so involved in this episode of Grand Theft Auto that they really thought that that's what they were doing. And the sad end to that is that the police were not hit, even though they shot at them several times. But the only way they could stop the girl who was standing in the driveway with a rifle shooting at them was to shoot her. And she survived, and she's in prison for 20 years, and the 12-year-old's in level 8 for till he's 18. But these were kids who were so involved in that gang. They had lived their life in foster care and Baker Acts and all kinds of things, but were so involved in that mentality or that fantasy of a gang culture that it led them to do what they did. So understanding a little bit about it, it's not fun stuff and it's not our world, but it's going to have to be your world if you're going to have to understand something about what these kids are going through.
There's actually a really good book called My Bloody Life, that's written by a former Latin king. If anyone wants to read about how he ended up going into the gang.
What's it called, Christy?
It's called My Bloody Life. And it's about a former Latin king, and he wrote it. It's really good.
And it's probably on Amazon for $12.99 because you can find just about everything on Amazon for $12.99. I think and I can hear it the way Christy says it. This is not fun stuff. It's really gang life is really, really violent. It's really, really dangerous. But understanding a little bit about it will at least help you to be aware of signs that you might see in the kids that you're working with. All of our kids would be vulnerable to this. Kids in foster care, kids in group homes. Who doesn't want a family? Usually they don't have a family. That's why they want a family. But once you're in that family, the whole dynamic changes. And if you're a girl, you're not in that family. You're there to provide them with an income. So one of the things that we have to do when we're trying to understand this population is understand they probably don't want to be with you, and they probably don't want to talk to you. That's why we kind of try to look when we get kids referred to us. We don't very often, the case manager does not very often call us and say, okay, I got this kid and this kid was a victim of human trafficking and now they're in a foster home and they're 12 years old and can you start therapy? Usually they don't even tell us that. Sometimes they don't even know that. We try to look for some of the clues that they might be. We certainly look for the history of sexual abuse. We look for kids who've had repeated runaways. In our intensive treatment program, we have worked with kids who have been frequent runaways. Sometimes just finding out that their menstrual cycle has been disrupted is a good clue. STDs, a lot of these kids come with a history of illness because, I mean, how are you not going to have an STD if you're having sex 10 times a day? So there's things that we look for when we are assessing if the case manager isn't aware of it or doesn't tell us that, because sometimes they don't. And certainly it's like with Christy's case, you're looking for that trauma bond with the boyfriend. And you really can't force kids. I don't know how many times, Christy, you had to have that conversation before the light bulb went on, but sometimes it doesn't happen overnight. And sometimes you have to have those conversations non-judgmentally and in ways that you don't want to look like you're lecturing or judging or whatever, but just trying to help them develop a new reality. And we just can't force that. We have to be patient. And this can be kind of slow work. I think the challenges that we have really is that these kids do run away. And sometimes they run away from the foster homes a lot. And for us, using the Medicaid model, if you have a kid and you go out, you do the bio, now you get 30 days to do the treatment plan, and all of a sudden this kid has run away for 3 weeks. It makes it difficult to get the kid back. The kid might go into a different home. You might have to start over again. And often they just don't trust anybody but their pimps. So it's slow work, and sometimes they are put in group homes to recruit other kids into the life. Sometimes they just don't believe that they've been victimized. So when we have had successes with really strong, non-judgmental, compassionate foster parents who are willing to kind of stay the course with this kid, and not to judge them and not to look at them as anything other than a victim who could not make this choice. Foster parents are pretty essential in this model, as are we, but foster parents are really essential. So if we look at the traditional methods that don't always work, this is what we have found with some of these CSEC victims, is that they have had such chronic, ongoing trauma that it's almost like, when we talk about resetting your brain so that you are in a place of safety. When our kids come into foster care, they're often just in high alert. They're always in that traumatized state. And so are these kids. So we almost need to reset them a little bit. And I can't say enough, you don't have to get them to tell the story. You just don't. Sometimes it just takes a while, and they may not be able to tell you the story because they don't know what the story is. If their story is that this is my boyfriend and I'm having sex for him because I love him and he's the only one that loves me. So if he tells me to do this, I'm going to do it. It's kind of hard for us to sit and listen to those things without jumping up and going, what do you mean he's your boyfriend? But one of the things over time that we have seen with kids that really, really have had a history of human trafficking is that sensory techniques work a lot better in the beginning. One of the things that, and when I say these 5 things, the victims of 9/11 who lived through 9/11 identified these 5 things as being the most helpful in recovering from the trauma of 9/11. And it was yoga, jogging, massage, EMDR, and acupuncture. None of that is traditional therapy. But what does yoga do? What does jogging do? What might that do to your parasympathetic nervous system? Especially yoga, if anybody is yoga-y. What does yoga do to your brain?
I mean, it's meditative, it's calming.
Yeah, it is calming. You're right. We don't always have access to EMDR or acupuncture. But jogging is another thing. I actually visited this is a long time ago, a safe house. It was one of the early safe houses. It was outside of Austin, Texas. And they had put the safe house out in the country, and they had put an electronic fence all around it because the kids ran away so much. But the staff, they were pioneers in the whole treatment of trafficking, and they were all young people. And one of them said to me, I go out jogging with a lot of them because if I don't jog with them, they're going to jog right out the gate. But jogging is also it kind of resets your brain. Massage, obviously, you have to be careful with, but there's certain kinds of massage that are helpful in helping kids to relax. It's like Christy said, it's all those kind of relaxation things that make people calm down and kind of begin to see what's really around them. But if your sympathetic nervous system is always fired up and you're always in that trauma state, you can't see things clearly. None of us can when we're in a kind of heightened high alert. So we look at some of these things. We talk to our therapist about yoga a lot, and we haven't done it as much since the pandemic. Before the pandemic, we had a lot of therapists who were doing yoga exercises with their kids, and it was really for calming things down. We have Good Night Yoga, which is a wonderful book that we have on our playlist on our YouTube channel. We had yoga pretzels, which were flashcards that the therapist would hold up and the kid would pick the pose and then they would do the pose together. But yoga is a great tool. But anything that you might do that is not talking to them about what happened to them is probably what you're going to do in the beginning. And it's okay. When I say it makes it hard to do the regular Medicaid model, I know that we want you to get that treatment plan done in 30 days. Well, if you spent 30 days yogaing or jogging, you're probably not going to have that done. So it's difficult work, and we just have to try to realize that when we are therapists, we think we have to get right to the trauma narrative. We got to get right to the story. Well, maybe you don't. Maybe you need to just get them to a point where they're calmer. And again, just don't be judgmental. That's the best. If take all these words on this slide, when somebody is sitting in front of you talking about their boyfriend and how wonderful he is, when they have scars all over them from what he did to them, it is hard not to jump out of your chair and say, what are you talking about? But you really have to kind of listen to their stories and not judge. And if those of you who have listened to me before know that when I first moved to Florida, I had done a lot of work in Massachusetts, mostly with sexual trauma victims. And I came here and I was sitting with some of these kids who had completely untreated sexual trauma. And they would start to tell me these god-awful stories. And I used to go, your therapeutic resting face is your best tool. If you don't go, what? And I found myself with some of these kids going, he did what? And then I just kind of had to sort of reset my resting therapy face and say, calm down. I had to calm down. So we have to, if you don't have a natural resting therapy face, practice it in front of a mirror, because you're going to have to be able to avoid passing judgment. And that is your key to successful treatment. If you can just listen to them until they reach a point where they go, that's probably not what really happened, is it? That's your best tool. We train you in all kinds of techniques, but your best tool is yourself, and your calmness and your kindness and your compassion and your way to not judge them. That's your best therapeutic tool. And when we're working with the male victims, and we don't talk as much about the male victims, but we do have male victims that we work with. The difficulty with the male victims, or with the gay kids, with the trans kids, is that they may not always recognize, in a way different than the girls, they may not recognize that what happened to them was victimization. They may think that this was their choice. They wouldn't have eaten or had any place to stay if they didn't agree to this. And they're always a lot more confused about their sexual identity, what happened to them. Was this really victimization? Did they do it because they needed to? Is it happening to them because they're gay or trans? And there's not a lot of shelters for male victims. There's not a lot of treatment for male victims, any more than there is for male victims of just sexual trauma. And I think I did find this one paper, Under the Radar, Sexual Exploitation of Young Men, and it's almost 20 some odd years old. There's just not a lot of stuff about male victims. The LGBT population, the other problem that we, well, obviously the problem that we have in Florida right now is that we're not allowed to do some of this stuff if we are in schools, but you guys are not in schools. You guys can meet these clients where they are. And if you have a client that wants to be called by certain pronouns, that's perfectly okay for you to do so. If you are being asked to respect their choice of where they want to be in their sexuality, of course you can do that. I wrote a policy not that long ago specifically to your ability and your responsibility to work with these youth. Sometimes kids who are in the community see sex work as their only choice, and they don't understand that they're being controlled by their pimps. They think that's what they have to do. Because remember, the gay and the trans world right now is very marginalized, especially in Florida. It's a tough time for these young people. And we have to be able to use their pronouns, talk to them about what they want. If you don't, you're never going to get past that point of helping them to understand their victimization. Because that population is vulnerable anyway, aren't they? I mean, most of them have been rejected by their families. Many times they've been rejected by their families. Apparently, unless you're in the entertainment industry, and they seem to do better at accepting their kids than other professions. So when I say this treatment model almost follows the DV model, because the DV domestic violence, it's almost the same mentality. If you're working with a woman, usually a woman, who's the victim of domestic violence, she usually is not going to leave even if she can. And the average time that DV victims leave is like 7 or 8 times before they finally get out. It's the same with kids that are trying to get out of the life or understanding it. They need some safety in order to get out of the life. And maybe the foster home that they're placed in, an understanding foster mother, an understanding therapist, a non-judgmental therapist might be the first chance that they have to say, okay, I can do this. And I really, really like Christy's story, and I'm glad I got it on recording because I'm going to post this on the YouTube channel. But Christy's story is a perfect example of just being there and listening and kind of trying to say, well, you didn't say you're stupid, you're not right. You didn't say any of those things. You just said there's this side and there's this side. You can figure it out for yourself. You got this choice, you got this choice, you can figure it out for yourself. And eventually your client did. And you're going to have to be patient because kids do run away. Actually, this is a quote from Lisa. And Lisa was running at the time, we had the intensive treatment program, and a lot of kids who were in the intensive treatment program were older youth that were in disrupted placements. And a lot of them had trauma bonds that we were having a hard time breaking. And what we were kind of discouraged when we first started the program because we didn't think we were getting any place. But one of the things that Lisa finally said, and I wrote it down because I thought it was true, is that she said our ITP kids still run, but when they do, they often call their therapists. So we feel like that's a mark of success. And that is true. They're going to run, they're going to reject you, but if they inch back to you after they run, if they inch back to you after they said, I don't want to talk to you, then that is a mark of success. Just measure your success in different ways is all I'd say. Because they're not going to sit down the second they see you and say, yes, I'm a victim of human trafficking, and yes, my pimp is horrible and awful, and I shouldn't have had that happen to me. That's not going to happen. So this is our final slide, and I would just say in closing that there is really no recognized evidence-based treatment model. We don't have one. I have always been a firm believer in doing what works because we're comfortable with it. You don't necessarily have to have extensive training in all of these models in order to do good work. You can take some risks, and I can only liken it to when I started my therapy practice, which was in the early 90s, and we had no evidence-based treatment for victims of sexual trauma. We didn't have it then. I mean, you all live with this stuff now, but we did not have that then. And we had to kind of all say, okay, we'll start someplace. We'll figure this out. This worked and this didn't work. But we weren't afraid to take some risks. And I don't want you to be afraid to take risks either. If you're working with a victim of trafficking and they don't want to talk to you, and then they let you talk to them a little bit, and then they don't want to talk to you, and then they let you talk to them for 10 minutes, that's success. Measure your success by what you're able to do, because they are worth it. I mean, these are kids that didn't ask to have this happen to them. And the extent to which it happens in this country is absolutely astounding. And you could be the first person that one of these kids talks to, as Christy's talking about, where you're sitting in front of them, you're not judging them, you're being kind to them, and maybe they begin to think, well, maybe I am worth it. So take a risk if you have. Don't do anything crazy, but take a risk and do what you think is going to work. And I guarantee you, as long as you have a nice therapeutic resting face and you're calm and you're non-judgmental, those are your best tools that you can have for working with these kids. So, comments, questions?
I thought it was really helpful. Actually, I have to get off now. I stayed because I wanted to see the end of it, but I have to go see a client. But I thought it was really good. Thank you.
Well, Christy, I always like your input. You always give us some good questions to chew on. So thank you for joining us. Anybody else have any questions or anything that they want to add? Was this helpful, not helpful? It's a tough subject because it's depressing. And nobody likes to be depressed all the time, but it is. Carol?
Excuse me. I just think that, you know, I've seen this several times now, this training, and even thinking back at things that now I know, and little tiny things that my older clients, you know, had told me when I first started. And I wish I would have had this information then, because I may have been able to direct things a little bit different in understanding them more, where they were coming from. But each time I hear this, you're always hearing something new, and it brings you back to an old experience, you know, and making it much better for people you're going to meet with in the future.
Yeah, don't we all, when we think back to clients that we had and we think, I'm completely missed that. They put it down right in front of me and I completely missed it. But you know, hindsight is 2020, and I'm telling you, this is something that we've been doing this training now since 2013, and it changes every time. The amount of money that gets poured into human trafficking, the amount of people that get sucked into it, it's not going away. It gets worse. The only thing is, I think we do recognize now, which we didn't before, was that if you don't think that Bike Week and NASCAR and any of the football things, Super Bowl, all of those things are such a magnet for human trafficking. And if we didn't live in a country where people wanted to have sex with children, we wouldn't be in this mess, but we are. So we are the helping professionals. And if we wanted to have a clean profession that didn't make us lose sleep at night, we wouldn't be here. So.
Sure, yeah, thank you.
Bonnie, anything?
I was thinking along the lines of what Carol said. I've seen this training over and over again, but, you know, just to be reminded that, you know, this is real. This isn't just what we read about in some other country, you know, that this is here in Tampa, you know, it just, we need that, like, I need that reminder. And like you said about the events and everything, and how many of those events occur right here in Tampa. It's crazy to me. So I appreciate it. It's always a good training.
It is amazing when you think about it, because this is Florida. We have so many huge events like that. And every time we have stings after these things.
And I don't even think it has to be huge events. Any event, you know, that goes on, they just see any kind of person that they can hone in on, or, you know, kind of detour from the rest of the crowd. But I think it was one of those, well, several of those trainings we went to, Barbara, on the sex trafficking, is how many law enforcement they actually hire, you know, to come in and work these bigger events, because there's so many people. And it just, you know, when
That's
you
what's
you think of it as being a fun experience, nice experience, but you don't go in that other direction.
Well,
And it's
Carol's
disheartening that
right. Say
there's
Bob.
so many perpetrators that
Mhm.
it's like supply and demand. The demand for these kids is there. That's what's so sickening about it, is that, you know, like you said, you know, Barbara, that um, we have this problem. You know, this is a serious problem in the United States, and so many people are just oblivious to it.
Right. Well, I can tell you that when we sit in the human trafficking, the police always have videos of their stings. And they're hard to watch because they're in the hotel room. They've got two or three police around a computer. And the guy's coming down the hall and you can get it on the security camera. And he's got the girl. He's going to shove her in the room with the guy. And they open the door and here's the police and they grab the guy. It's pretty graphic stuff. But it's amazing, and Bonnie's right. There's so many people that have no idea that any of this is going on. So I think it's important for our therapists to just understand how to work with these kids. And if they don't respond right away, don't say that your self-worth is, as a therapist, is not there, because it is. So
Well, and I just want to add one more thing and I'll be quiet. And this happened personally. My husband knows a lot of the law enforcement here in town in Bradenton. And he just went to our neighborhood Publix. And he sees this lady who he thinks is a lady, but thinks is, oh, maybe she's a teenager, not really quite sure. And as he looked at her as he's walking through the parking lot, he recognized her as one of the detectives. And he just kind of, you know, got eye contact and no one else was around, but she just says, George, keep walking. You know, like, don't ask me what I'm doing. And I guess what came to me was, why are they in our neighborhood? Something in our neighborhood is going on, you know, for them to be having a little sting operation there at our, you know, little Publix neighborhood. So that just kind of gave me creeps. And then, of course, I go home and I have to look up on the website to see how many sex offenders live in our neighborhood, which I wish I wouldn't have done that, because there's one in every block.
well, and you know, they don't even have to be sex offenders. These guys, when they do these stings, especially in Daytona, because they put all their pictures in the paper, they're your neighbors.
Yeah.
It's just people that don't necessarily think they're having sex with children, but they certainly know that they are young. So it's like the very first the undercover cop talking to the guy, and he said, I don't have anything younger than 14. And then he referred to them as women because he didn't want to say, oh, they're kids. So but yeah, it's a tough problem. And every time I do it, I think back to before the Safe Harbor Act. It was awful for these kids because they already felt like dirt, and then they'd get arrested. And now they're in DJJ, and they're in DJJ as a prostitute. So it wasn't a good situation. But I will do the CEUs and so forth tomorrow. I don't know if Dylan's still here or not, but and I think Maritza was having trouble with her. She texted me at one point and said that wherever she's in Kissimmee, sounds like they were having a really bad storm, so she kept going in and out.
It's just hitting at my house right now. I see the trees. I worry about my pool. The
Well,
trees all blowing everywhere.
yeah, we're supposed to have thunderstorms, and I think all of Florida is under a tornado watch at this point.
Yeah.
So, and it's supposed to start raining, but at least we made it through this. We didn't get kicked off this. So, all right, you guys, have a good rest of your day.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye-bye.